every interruption forces re-engagement. And you could be asking yourself, is Taylor trying to tap into something else going on here? What is she really talking about? Well, I'm talking about purling and why people tend to think that purling is such a pain in the ass. Hi, my name is Taylor, and today I want to talk about something called purling, an integral stitch in the craft of knitting. And this isn't because I think there's anything wrong with it or that I hate purling. It's because I think it opens up a really interesting conversation and discussion around rhythm, interruption, and attention, and all that sort of thing. This video feels especially relevant right now, as I have been, if you watched the last video, spending a lot of time working on my terrazzo sweater by Petite Knit, which has a remarkable amount of knitting compared to purling. In fact, there's so little purling, it's pretty much saved for the ribbing on the cuffs and the collar and the hemline. And I have noticed that I absolutely melt into that project. Like my brain just fully settles into it. And the more I think about that, the more I realize that this doesn't have a lot to do with purling at all, the actual act of the purl stitch. I mean, not entirely. It's definitely part of it. I think it has more to do with the joy of uninterrupted rhythm. Because the truth is, I don't even necessarily dislike purling. I just really enjoy the rhythm of knitting. And I think those two things are very different. Honestly, I think I land pretty close to where Elizabeth Zimmerman, in my opinion, is kind of the OG of instructional knitting, would have landed on this. She often encouraged knitting in the round, minimizing purl rows as much as possible, leaning into knitting as the more natural and continuous motion. And I think that's the important distinction here. This isn't purling is bad and knitting is good, or purling is more difficult and knitting is super simple. It's more like, why does one motion feel so much more psychologically cooperative than the other, and physiologically and ergonomically? Because structurally, they're equals. Knit and purl stitches are mirror of one another. In fact, you can't have one without having the other, whether it's in your actual technique or in the form itself. One will exist where the other exists. There's no hierarchy there, but physically and psychologically, they feel very different, at least for me. I will speak for myself, and I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling this way, but of course your mileage may vary. And feel free, as I know you will, to share that down below in the comments. I feel like there's something about knitting that is very easy for the human nervous system to settle into. When you're purling, and we're going to compare this to knitting as well, but when you're purling, you have a needle coming towards you and you have yarn going away from you. Your needle pokes through the stitch from back to front, but your yarn goes over the needle tip from front to back. So you have two competing motions happening here. And as easy as it can be, it becomes kind of second nature if you have experience knitting and purling for a long time. It still is doing two different things, psychologically speaking, and that is making these little micro decisions. Your hands are making little decisions. Your brain is making obviously most of those decisions, and things are happening here that are, though minutely, competing with one another. A forward motion and a backward motion, or I should say a back to front motion and a front to back motion, if you are knitting the way that I'm knitting. Of course, if you're knitting in continental, it might be different. If you are doing a different kind of throwing technique, it could be different. But generally speaking, purling, needle goes back to front, yarn goes front to back, wrapping around the needle, and there's just a little bit of something happening there that interrupts what would otherwise be a very natural forward, continue motion, if you will. When we knit, the yarn is in the back. Your movement is forward, both with the needle going from front to back, as well as the yarn moving forward around the tip of the needle. Your hands stop making little decisions after a while, and you can just go on autopilot. This is where you can sit and you can watch a movie, you can have a conversation with someone, you can read, perchance. I know that's a hard one for some folks, but I've gotten to the point where I can sit down and read, and that is amazing. But as soon as purling enters the equation, at least in terms of the back and forth of a ribbing, that becomes a little bit more complicated, and that's fine. But it is a little bit more complicated for a reason. But as you knit, like I'm doing now, the movement becomes so repetitive that it is almost soothing to the nervous system. It becomes so familiar to your conscious brain. It is just continue, on and on into the sunset of, knitting dreamland. And that's also why I think it's really interesting that a lot of knitters will describe stockinette, which is what I'm doing right now, where I am doing all knit stitch on the right side and all purl stitch on the wrong side, as calming. But it's also at the same time mocked for being boring. And I just feel like those two things are not the same thing. Boredom and calm are doing two different things in our brains. And I sometimes think that maybe a person perceiving something as boring that somebody else would perceive as calm has a lot to do with what is going on outside of the actual knitting itself. Perhaps the person who finds stockinette stitch to be calming is somebody who would otherwise have a very, I don't know, exciting and chaotic external or outside existence to the actual sitting and knitting portion of their day. Whereas a person who would find it to be boring, maybe their day was relatively uneventful, not a lot going on, and sitting down doing something that is pretty repetitive over and over again just feels like more of the same. And sometimes more of the same can become boring. I don't know, just a thought. But for me, repetitive motion isn't understimulating. Sometimes it's regulating. Repetition without interruption is psychologically powerful. It's why people walk to think. It's why repetitive prayer exists in so many religions around the world. Why we rock babies. Why pacing helps regulate stress. Why mosh pits exist despite being loud and uproarious and raucous and maybe even a little bit dangerous. There is a repetition to the movement and everybody is doing it together. And it seems chaotic, but in a way it brings everybody into this calm, trance-like state. Maybe not calm, that might not be the right answer and might not be the right word, but there is something happening there in that repetition. The nervous system loves predictable rhythm. Your brain stops bracing for change. There's actually a psychological framework for this, and it's called flow state. There's a psychologist, his name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I practiced that one, it's Hungarian. I hope I got it right. And he coined this idea of flow state. And these are essentially periods of deep immersion. Self-consciousness fades, time seems to change, your attention narrows, and action starts to feel almost automatic. And knitting is kind of perfect for that, especially simple knitting. Now, I want to step off to the side of this conversation though and provide a little bit of a contrasting outlook, because I believe that there are some folks out there, myself included at times, where flow state is more easily achieved when I'm doing something that has just enough challenge to keep me fully locked in and engaged. And maybe that's not flow state, maybe that's just true, pure engagement. But sometimes I feel like if there's something that just keeps me that much more attentive to what I'm doing, that I can lock into that flow state a little bit more easily. But then there are days when that is not the case, and having something that is essentially mindless, meaning that I don't have to think about what I'm doing with my hands, that can throw me into a flow state as well, and I can lose track of time. So it really depends. In fact, I would like to know from you which of those seems more conducive to flow state. And for me, sometimes it depends on what I'm doing. Sometimes if I'm doing something like painting or sketching or something more like visual arts related, I find that the challenge will send me into flow state. Painting might be a little bit different. I don't know, but I do think that there is something to be said for that state of flow when everything seems effortless and mindless and almost automatic. Long stretches of stockinette can become so repetitive as to be almost meditative. There's low interruption and it's rhythmically stable. And I think when it comes to why people prefer knitting as to purling, and perhaps maybe talk about purling as if it's more difficult, really has a lot more to do with the fact that there's comparatively less of that when you're purling, particularly when you're going back and forth between knits and purls. And I think that's why purling, for whatever reason, just never quite disappears in the motion. I do think that repetitive purling over time can disappear, just like anything repetitive can disappear in terms of how we are perceiving it in the moment. We can get so locked in, it becomes so repetitive that it's just easy to do and simple and becomes naturally more efficient. But the slightly less direct nature of the purling movement, yarn moving from front to back, needle moving from back to front, there's just a little bit more management involved there. So even when you settle into long stretches of purling, your brain still kind of feels like it needs to supervise the operation. Knitting lets your brain wander. But now, going back to what I was saying about ribbing and how I think this might be where purling tends to get its negative, veil, if you will, is when it's done with knits. When you're throwing a purl in there to create a texture, whether it's ribbing, whether we're talking about a moss stitch or something like that, where pearls are there to add a little bit of texture. It's gorgeous. And I think knits and pearls, using those together to create texture is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to create texture out of all the different ways that you can do it, lace, cabling, what have you. But that inconsistency of motion is, I think, where we start to think of purling as a little bit of a pain compared to knitting because of what it does to the rhythm. You're repositioning your needles, you're repositioning your yarn from back to front. Your hands never really fully settle into one single motion. It's stop and go knitting. And sometimes that stop and go can be very fast and efficient, and that is true, but it's still happening. And those little minute stops and starts are noted by your brain. It has to attend to that constantly. It can be exhausting in a very particular way. In fact, this is funny. This just happened yesterday. I had no plans about talking to this, but we were going to the grocery store yesterday, my husband and I, and this particular grocery store we were going to has a really complicated parking lot. You've probably been to grocery stores like that. Well, he said to me, he's like, I'm going to take you on this other way that I get out of this parking lot. It's a little bit longer, but it's a lot less of a pain in the butt. And so we get going, and he takes us around the building to the back, out onto this other street, does a left, turn onto this lane, and then gets to a light and then makes a left turn. And it was seamless. We were moving the whole time, but it was longer. It was just a longer distance to do it. But we both acknowledged the fact that had we gone the technically shorter distance, it would have been so much more mentally taxing because it would have required lots of stop and go, lots of letting traffic through, lots of pedestrian traffic, and just overall kind of a pain in the butt. And it's funny because now thinking back on something that just happened yesterday, it is true. Sometimes we'll take the longer route if it means we can be continuously driving to get from point A to point B, as opposed to stop and start. Stop and start is constantly keeping the nervous system aware and actively engaged. And sometimes sometimes it's good to do that. But sometimes to soothe the nervous system, to massage it down, the repetition is really important, especially if you want that meditative flow state. I guess this is also why sometimes when you have these fragmented work days where you feel like there's lots of moving parts in your day, nothing feels settled into any kind of rhythm, you have different things going on that seem maybe somewhat unrelated, even though they might be related, those days always feel more taxing. I mean, if we really wanted to get into this is why constant notification can make people feel mentally exhausted, whether it's a buzz on your phone or some kind of a notification that you have an email or a knock at the door randomly in the middle of the day. Every interruption forces re-engagement. And you could be asking yourself, is Taylor trying to tap into something else going on here? What is she really talking about? Well, I'm talking about purling and why people tend to think that purling is such a pain in the ass. And I think it's because it breaks the repetition. It takes something that could be otherwise very meditative and soothing to be something that you have to engage in, that you have to actively sort out as you're doing it. Even when you're doing repetitious purling, it's still, there's something there that just makes you feel like you got to be turned on every so often. And maybe for somebody who leads a very busy life, maybe you have a hectic existence, maybe you have a lot going on, you might be one of those people who tends to find purling a little bit more annoying than those who have very little going on in their day-to-day. Everything is very pleasing and chill and calm and plain and level-headed. And those people might like a little purling in their life to shake things up. It really just depends, right? It's all relative. but I couldn't help but explore it because I knew there was some kind of a psychological factor there. I also think it's really interesting that you hear people talk about, different techniques that fix purling or make purling just feel better or more efficient. Like Norwegian purling is considered to be more efficient. Portuguese purling is considered to be more efficient. You could do combination knitting or just have your alternate gauge techniques, if you will. And I know there are people out there who swear by finding their method of purling. And once they found their method of purling, it opened up a whole new world of knitting existence for them. And everything just seemed to flow forth with absolute and utter ease. And it's funny because I tend to feel that way once I discovered flicking, which is a form of knitting. And it makes me think that, when it comes to fixing purling or finding techniques that make purling more efficient, there are lots of techniques out there that claim to do the same thing for knitting. So it's not necessarily that purling requires so much more fixing. I don't think either of them do really, but that people are developing techniques for both to make it more efficient, whether it's easier or faster or more speed. They both have them. But purling, for whatever reason, and I think it's for some of the reasons that I mentioned in this video, always seems to be the one that's like, I don't know, the less attractive sibling, if you will, to knitting. It's like the Marsha Brady. I think it's like the Marsha Brady. Who's the middle Brady? It's not Marsha Brady. It's the middle Brady. Who's the middle Brady? Middle Brady girl. It's not Marsha because she's Jan. It's the Jan Brady. It's the Jan Brady. Purling is the Jan Brady of knitting. I don't think there's not three. So it's the Marsha Brady is knitting and it's the Jan Brady which is purling. Okay. And I think that that's kind of what happens. Marsha's not perfect either. And Marsha needs to be corrected as well sometimes for some people to make it more efficient, to make her more palatable, right? But Jan Brady, for whatever reason, no matter how hard she tries, she's still Jan Brady. And Marsha always seems to be the one in the spotlight. And honestly, I don't know about thinking about all of this made me think about purling any differently, but it did have me thinking. What is it about purling that makes purling such a Jan Brady of things? Why do certain projects feel so restful? Why some motions let the brain soften a little and others keep us just slightly more aware? And I think that's why purling may feel different to some knitters. It just interrupts something that knitting tends to do exceptionally well, which is create this really smooth, continuous rhythm that helps soothe our nervous system and potentially leads us to flow state. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today and listening to me ramble about this. Let me know your thoughts down below. I love to hear your guys' perspective on these kinds of things. I will catch you in the next one. Happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.